at the Ideas Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, where I am responsible for civil society collaboration. Now, I would like to request our moderator, Smita, to start the session and moderate. Over to you, Smita.
Thank you so much, Swapnil, and good to be here. Hello to Paulomi and Amreen and the Offices of Interdisciplinary Studies at Jindal Global University. Hello to Saptarshi, Shravasti, Dr. Kaushik. I'm actually in Uttar Pradesh. I've just started off the campaign trail today. I'm, outside one of the most prominent, in fact, youth Dalit voices today, Chandrasekhar's house. So he will be heading out to political rallies, and I will be on that trail. And it's clouded. I'm hoping that it doesn't start raining and pouring even as we talk. So my apologies in advance if at any point my connection looks a little glitchy, in which case I'll try and switch to audio from the video mode. And you'll see a lot of these, in fact, sea of supporters, people here waiting outside Chandrasekhar's house, wearing the blue patkas. So it's very interesting time. As a journalist, of course, as for somebody who covers foreign policy and somebody who covers politics, of course, elections are as exciting as traveling to Pakistan to cover a story. And the 543 seats of the Lok Sabha that are up for grabs, 4th June, we get to know whether it's Mr. Modi returning for a rare third consecutive term, which looks the case. He definitely seems to be in pole position. Or could there be a major surprise, some sort of a silent voting wave? 7 phases of elections. Of course, we are already in election mode with the Model Code of Conduct, but the first round of polling there, starting from 19th of April, goes on till 1st of June. Today, the weather seems to be very, very pleasant. It's been raining since morning, bad for the farmers and bad for the paddy and the wheat growers, but increasing heat wave, that's also going to impact perhaps the voter turnout. So let me try and bring in our panelists here. And I know that Saptarshi is heading to Manipur in the next few hours. Shravasti said that in the next week onwards, she's also going to be on the campaign trail. So let me start, this conversation by asking each of you. And if you want to go first, Dr. Kaushik, in brief, give me the one defining idea of 2024. When you're thinking of 2024 elections, what do you think is the idea or the subject that is going to define these elections? Dr. Kaushik?
Yeah, thanks, Smita. Thank you very much. Well, 2024 elections, as I think everybody living in India or abroad would say, everybody seems to be very confident about the opinion that the answer or the outcome has to be BJP dominated. It may range from the number of seats and number of votes, that may range, but the definite answer seems to be that the BJP is dominating at the moment. But this kind of simple answer anybody could give. So I thought, what is it that is coming from some data analysis. So I have been working on these issues, and one of the aspects that is very interesting for me to observe is, yes, it is fine if you are looking at binaries of win or loss. It is fine to count number of wins and then you make an opinion, but that is not the end of it. Actually, you need to look at the quality of victory. And how do we understand quality of victory? There are multiple ways in which you can understand it. So one famous phrase in Indian electoral system has been that it is not the majority that wins, it is the plurality that wins. What does that mean? It means even if you have got like 35% of the votes in a particular constituency, given nobody else has got similar votes, you are still the winner. So you do not actually need a huge support, or think of Lok Sabha elections in total. For example, in one of the elections, 1984, I remember, I think the highest vote share ever in Indian history was still not 50%. It was less than that, which means, and
400 plus seats for Rajiv
yeah,
Gandhi in those
yes,
elections.
exactly. So a huge seat share, more than a significant share of seats, but the vote share was still not even 50%. So in Indian history, no political party has generated vote share which is that high. Now let us come to BJP's story.
Dr. Kaushik, I'll come back to you because I just wanted to set the ball rolling with each speaker coming in on this one defining idea. You make an interesting point there that regardless of what the outcome is on 4th of June, let's remember in mind that vote share and the number of seats they could be two different things. It doesn't really represent the idea of one homogeneous India. There is a diversity there. Shravasti, for you at this moment, what do you think is going to be the key issue defining these elections?
Hi, Smita, and very good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I think for me, the biggest issue as I see it through conversations with people, not just on the ground at this time, but also during the previous assembly elections as well, that there's a huge problem of unemployment and price rise that is that is affecting every section of the population. And that is also evidenced from the fact that the CSDS survey, which was released last week, a lot of people overwhelmingly across sections speaking about unemployment and price rise. But whether that will translate into votes and a vote against the BJP, which, as you mentioned, is in the pole position and very definitely so, we'll just have to see. But it's a very interesting aspect where there's a clear economic distress. But will that really translate into a political vote for or against the ruling party is something that for me is quite interesting to see.
Okay, economic distress. And I will come to, in fact, some of the data points of that survey that Shravasti just mentioned. Saptashi, for you, you're going into this election campaign, which is the one big issue you're looking at.
I mean, I too, like looking at the CSDS data, 27% said unemployment, 23% said inflation is a big issue. So I too was hoping that these two will be the biggest issues for voters in this election. And then, other data sets also are encouraging. 80% say that India is home to all religions, right? So for anybody on the streets who says that BJP is just a polarizing party and it has successfully polarized the electorate, may want to rethink that because, I mean, according to the findings of this survey, at least. But we all know elections in India are nothing without some kind of polarization, especially with 22nd January this year. So to me, I think the defining issue would really be the opposition ability to convince voters that it too does look out for the majority, which is like the Hindu population. The BJP has played this game so well that they have not only convinced voters that they are the rescuers of religion, but also that anybody else is out there to get you for votes cheaply. So I think the defining factor really is A, religion, and B, the opposition's ability to sort of, make the perception game in their favor. Without that, nothing else is going to happen.
Okay, there's a huge perception battle. The opposition there talking about saving the idea of India, talking about India's constitution, the values of secularism enshrined in our preamble. You've seen the Congress's, of course, Nyay Patra that was released, their manifesto. Today, Prime Minister Modi releasing Sankalpa Patra, which is the BJP's manifesto. But for the BJP today, the biggest manifesto is really Prime Minister Modi himself, because their entire campaign is based on Modi ki guarantee. And before I come to that CSDS survey, I do want to come back to you, Saptashi and Shravasti. As a reporter, while I was driving in here, today it's Ambedkar Divas. Just when we entered this village where Chandrasekhar lives, there were some preparations on to bring out like a little rally remembering Ambedkar. But in my entire drive all the way from Delhi, I've not seen a single political sort of a momentum or a mood that you normally get to see with elections. Of course, there are those big hoardings which have Prime Minister Modi's schemes which are advertised, but the rally feeling of banners, of slogan shouting, that's not there. Do you get a feeling that these elections so far, right now, the campaign is still in a lackluster mood, Saptashi?
I think it could be, I mean, it shouldn't be, right? We are like 5 days from the first day of voting. So I think 3 more days until campaigning is stopped by as per the rules of the EC. But I think one reason why we might be seeing that is really because the results just seem so predetermined. I mean, if tomorrow if like on 4th June we see that the voter turnout is not very high, say lower than 2019 and 2014, it will confirm a theory that people just thought, we all know what's going to happen, so let's not just go out to vote. And I don't know if the same is reflecting in the stance of other political parties who just think that they don't have the time or the money to spend on these elections because the results are again just so predetermined, and the media has a big role to play in that. For the last 1 year, mainstream media has fed us this notion that the BJP is invincible, whether that is surveys or whether that is interviewing the prime minister and asking him extremely simple questions. Let's not get into those details, but I think that is what has been fed to both like my age group and even my parents' age group. I was speaking to them yesterday and I said, you have your voter ID cards ready, right? Because like Delhi votes in like mid-May. And they were like, yeah, but क्या करे, हमें तो पता ही है 7 सीट यहाँ कहाँ जाएंगी. So if that is the perception amongst so many categories of people, then yeah, I mean, a lackluster campaign doesn't seem very surprising.
Shravasti, for us journalists, when we hit the ground, our weather vanes are usually the taxi wale bhaiyas and the chai wale bhaiyas. उनके साथ पहले बातचीत करते हैं हम every time we parachute drop into a city to try and understand the local mood. But given that you're in Delhi and what Saptarshi was referring to, I mean, if you've had a sitting chief minister arrested under serious allegations of PMLA, of course, the Aam Aadmi Party has garnered some rallies in Ramlila Maidan, the opposition front has come together, some protests here and there. But so far in your conversations that you're having in Delhi with friends, family, and of course, people around you, does there seem to be any excitement about the elections? Any sort of a momentum that is building up where people think that, perhaps there will be a change or perhaps some surprises could come by?
I would have to agree with Saptarshi on this, that there is not much of a surprise element in this election. I would compare it to 2019, where there was a lot more enthusiasm and anticipation of some kind of change or possibility of change. This time it seems quite settled. Coming back to your point about Kejriwal's arrest in Delhi, we have seen, as compared to other places, we have seen the Aam Aadmi Party after Kejriwal's arrest putting up a kind of a spirited fight against the BJP, whether it's in Ramlila Maidan or generally their presence on social media and in every news platform, in fact, to kind of hammer the fact that Kejriwal's arrest is nothing but political. And in my conversations with, as you were mentioning, general people, auto walas, and in marketplaces, and the perception is that the arrest has been with elections in mind. But the fact is also that in the voters' mind, that seed of doubt has already been placed. So the general voter is thinking that if he is innocent, why has he been arrested? So it is a perception game, but it is also it appears to be settled that the voter knows that the BJP is coming to power. So it's a little a perception game wise. Of course, the BJP is winning, but I would say in comparison to other opposition parties, for instance, the Congress, even at its manifesto release, the Congress, to my mind, appeared quite demotivated. So at least the Aam Aadmi Party is putting up a fight and is seen to be putting up a fight in this election. As I travel further next week, I'll know a little bit better about how the situation is everywhere else. But in Delhi, it seems like that right now.
But I think we also need to remember that at the end of the day, it's not a level playing ground that it seems today, because when it comes to the media coverage of issues, definitely traditional mainstream media, legacy TV houses, it's all extremely one-sided. And whatever opposition feed that people are receiving is essentially through either social media or through independent platforms, where also, in fact, a lot of, sort of whip is being lashed now. So, Dr. Kaushik, I know you're into economics, and before I start talking economics and jobs, a political question to you. This entire narrative that has constantly been built, that there is Tina, that who is the alternative to Mr. Modi. Is this election in the history of the past elections that you have voted for really looking very presidential? That if there is no faith against Mr. Modi, basically people will not have a choice. Because in the past, we have had elections in India where you've had faceless elections. And we talk about 77, we talk about 1989. But in this case, it is a very clear-cut presidential format, that because the opposition does not project one clear face against Mr. Modi, that is also adding to advantage. And perhaps this is a very clear-cut going to be a referendum on Mr. Modi himself.
Yeah, actually, so rightly pointed out, actually, there have been many political commentators in recent past who have actually said that one of the ways in which you can reform the political system of India is probably go towards another system, probably because that is what is, essentially happening, or a closer approximation of that. So Tharoor has been saying that we should actually adopt a presidential system. And in my book also, we had thought about some solutions to the problem of discrepancy between, this disproportional representation of not, voters not getting translated into the number of seats for different parties. For example, BSP in 2014 elections, being the third largest party, did not win even a single seat. This kind of system. So rather than continuing with first past the post system, what we do, we adopt a different system. But I would also like to put in one example, which is reading between the lines and reading behind what the data suggests. So in Gujarat elections, it seemed to everyone that historically it has been the best elections that BJP has won, the last one. And so I personally did some calculations on one variable that we calculate called disproportionality, which is like how far is the seat share from the vote share. And it turns out that historically high value of disproportionality in the last elections. And a simple explanation for that would be consider Aam Aadmi Party. So Aam Aadmi Party's rise has been very peculiar. In the state of Punjab, for instance, if you compare last elections, suddenly you find Aam Aadmi Party government forming in Punjab, and in the previous elections, the voters turnout was much in favor of Aam Aadmi Party. And if you look at Gujarat, they had a huge vote share, but the number of seats were not too many. So what it suggests is, even though in one elections you may find that it's not translating into seats, but you see on ground something is happening, and that something is a very high degree of disproportional representation, which was never before. So BJP winning, the story is BJP has won the best elections in Gujarat, but the behind story is that the disproportionality has also been the highest. There are so many parties who have got so many votes, in terms of people's support. They have got so much support, but the seats have not translated simply because first past the post system. And so if you have an aggregate system, a kind of presidential system, such problems can be avoided. Or you think of any other system called proportional representation, in which
Okay, but that's another longer debate, of course, that one can always come back to and talk about. But today, my question was that does it look like a very clear-cut case that this is simply a referendum on Mr. Modi, these elections?
I think the way in which it is projected to people, that there is no alternative, and also this India forum, even though it looked as if there would be some alternative. And I think I was reading some surveys, and people said, like, even if you combine all of them based on the opinion polls, they did not cross 200 level. So, which simply means that as of now, there is no strong face, and it's smaller faces, like people who have been regional. For example, Kejriwal is not actively participating, and many of other high-level politicians are also behind the bars. So, not very clear alternative to people, I think, as of now.
Okay, and does that actually look like an issue with people that you're talking to, Shravasti, that there are issues of social justice that has been promised in the Congress manifesto. There are liberal progressive ideas there, some good ideas, also in terms of the marginalized communities, whether it's economically, whether it's gender. But is this a constant question that you're hearing in the WhatsApp references in your ecosystem? Interestingly, though, in the CSDS survey that we were talking about, and just to tell the viewers, this is a survey done by CSDS Lokniti. It's a it's a prominent, in fact, credible institute that's been doing a lot of election surveys. So this is a pre-poll survey that was done between 1st to 8th April. The entire interview was done face to face. It wasn't done on phone. It wasn't done on mail. 10,000 random samples, of course, taken and the numbers extrapolated. And where they seem to suggest that 47% today actually still think of Mr. Modi as being the top prime ministerial choice. There's a 20% gap with Rahul Gandhi, who comes in at 27%. And Arvind Kejriwal and Mamata Banerjee, though are ruling states at the moment, they are at an acceptance level of 3% each. So the gap between Mr. Gandhi and Mr. Modi remains, but Gandhi does seem to have, in fact, added on to his acceptance level pan India. So is this a big concern that people are constantly talking about, that it doesn't matter, it's not the party that we are voting for, it's a face that we are voting for?
Definitely, Mr. Modi's personality cult has only grown over the years. It's not that there has been any I would say in the general perception of the public, there has not been any dip in Modi's popularity. Even when there are failures, for instance, when people are complaining about unemployment and inflation, they won't necessarily relate it to Modi. They will call it the government's problem, a state government problem, which has also been reflected in the CSDS survey, where they have attributed blame to the state government. Of course, the question can be raised that in many states in India, it is a BJP government. So whether the double engine government is working or not is a question. But the fact is that these failures are not attributed to Modi directly. Even during COVID, we saw that when the pandemic was raging, people were angry and people were asking questions of the government, but those questions were not directed at Modi. So the figure of Modi has been successfully crafted as a personality that is different and separate from the government, and an overarching popularity continues to this day. But to add to your point earlier about the opposition figure, I think the India Alliance has lost a lot of time last year, when it could have invested in building alliances, and that the Congress's decision to focus on the assembly elections, and the thought process behind it, perhaps, that we will win these crucial Hindi heartland states. And once we do that, that will provide us with the momentum that is required for the 2024 elections, that they lost crucial alliance building time over there. Perhaps if Nitish Kumar, I know that the CSDS survey is showing that these regional leaders are not much of a face, but if the entire opposition bloc was able to come together much in advance, when the alliance building started in June last year, and was able to build a face, whether that is Rahul Gandhi or Nitish Kumar or whoever it is, you have to devote that kind of time into creating an image, a perception among the people that there is an option. You cannot come in 3 months before the election and say, vote for us. That's not going to happen, especially in competition with a person like Modi and the machinery of the BJP, which, again, coming back to your previous point about a level playing field, the money power that the BJP has is not comparable to any other political party. And even today, as we speak, the Congress has had its accounts frozen. But even on that ground, have they been able to mobilize people? Has that message reached to the common man on the ground that the Congress, the main opposition party's accounts are frozen, and how will they fight elections? Is that message in among the common people? Perhaps not. So mobilization is a problem, and the alliance building and opposition, the fact that the opposition is an option, has to reach the people, and you have to build on that. 2 months before elections is, even now as we speak, in Delhi, for instance, the Congress has not announced its candidates. The Aam Aadmi Party has announced 4 candidates a month back. Even now, the voters of Delhi don't know who is the Congress candidate in alliance with the Aam Aadmi Party. So all these things matter to the voter. What is the opposition doing? And in the face of not a credible option, and a huge personality figure of the BJP, the Modi factor is clearly ahead, I would say.
Right. And of course, the Modi factor has a lot of other layers to it. It's also the delivery of the welfare schemes beyond caste barriers. It's also about Hindutva. It's about the polarization too. But Saptarshi, in fact, there is an audience question that I would like to take in because it just leads into what Shravasti was talking about. And to the people who are watching us on YouTube, this live stream, feel free to keep putting in your question on the chat box. We are trying to take them through. Somebody has asked that what would be the role of the media in building or reframing these perceptions? Like with Kejriwal's arrest, bringing out the evidence of the arrest or showing that this is curbing of his campaign. Do you think media's narratives have any power in constructing ideas of the political events of the public?
I mean, okay, just to give a small example, electoral bonds data, it was released 8:30 p.m. And we all started working on it. We all had our Excel sheets, blah, blah, blah. Something told me, just put on Aaj Tak, Republic and Times Now on the side. Till 11:30, 11:45. So 8:30 to 11:45, those 3 crucial hours when most television sets are on. Log ghar aate hain, kaam ke baad, khate TV dekhte hain, news dekhte hain. They were only discussing one nation, one election for those 3 hours. It took them 3.5 hours to get their junior moderators to start a debate on electoral bonds, in which the moderators themselves then propagated, what's the big deal? The whole counter argument that everybody gets political funding. There is no big deal in electoral bonds. So anyway, that I leave to them. Just the fact that the public was not informed by television channels, the 3 big television channels, that electoral bonds data has come out, which is going to, sort of expose what sort of corruption has been running in the system. So, I mean, and that is just one example. We have seen instances of really sensationalizing crimes, which have even a small, which have the role of, say, Hindus and Muslims, it becomes a totally, a riot-esque affair. So I think, I don't want to get into which politician owns which media houses or which business houses own which media channels and how they are linked to politicians. That is not for me to do. That is for senior journalists to do. But just for viewers, I think by now viewers should try and understand that big television houses are really not serving them. The pattern is really clear in their coverage in the last 7 to 8 years. The most recent one was electoral bonds. And yeah, whatever little resistance there is to all of this does come from independent journalists and small media portals. And once the resistance gets too much, the ED knocks on your doors. So, I don't really know what the state of the media will be after the 2024 elections when the BJP comes, if the BJP comes back even more emboldened. So,
Can I
yeah.
just add to this, to the audience who asked this
Can I
question,
just
because
add
of
to
course,
this?
yeah, just one point that I wanted to make was that in 20 years of my journalism, I've been through some excellent newsrooms with excellent editors where we stood up for what news was. And the Anna Hazare corruption case was a classic case where media did a wall-to-wall coverage, which is why that message could be amplified in 2011-12. उस वक्त मीडिया ने ऐसा माहौल बनाया कि ऐसा लगा कि लोगों की जेब से पैसे ले लिए हो, गांधीज ने, डॉक्टर मनमोहन सिंह ने, लोग गुस्से में सड़कों पर आए. लेकिन वो इसलिए हुआ because traditional mainstream media was covering that story morning till night, which is not the case now. So, in fact, Shravasti, when you add your point, there is a next question for you, and then I'll go back to Dr. Kaushik, which says that do you think the corruption on the electoral bonds affects the BJP campaign?
I would say that perhaps not, because of the point that you mentioned, the fact that traditional media has not provided the kind of coverage that the electoral bonds scam, it's nothing else apart from a scam needed. Like, just to give an example, to build on what Saptarshi was also just saying, that when the full data of the electoral bonds was published along with the unique identity numbers which allowed us to match who gave how much to whom, within minutes of that being published, the ED officials reached Arvind Kejriwal's house, and wall-to-wall coverage across all media channels was on Kejriwal's arrest. Electoral bonds was completely forgotten, and that continued for the next few days, which was, in a way, the BJP's idea to change the narrative. And just to go back to before that as well, when the first data was published, on that very day, the CAA rules, Citizenship Amendment Act rules were notified. So there is a concerted effort by the BJP-controlled media and these traditional media houses, which we know are very lenient towards the government, to change the narrative, to control the narrative in the way that they want to. And they are being able to do so because these media houses are not showing the news that matters and doing whatever the government wants to do. So, as you were mentioning about the Anna Hazare movement, even now, if you go to people, they will say, yes, Congress is corrupt, 2G, 4, etc. What is the scam? They don't know. But they know that they're corrupt. So a similar narrative could have come across with the electoral bonds scam as well, if the media played its role and said that, yes, there has been a huge amount of corruption. Possibly it's not possible for every layman on the road to understand the whole. It is quite technical. It's not possible, perhaps, for everyone to get into the nitty-gritties and the details of it. But just to communicate the fact that this is a huge amount of money that has gone into the coffers of the ruling party, and laws have been changed in the country to allow this, and the Supreme Court has come down heavily, and how the government has gone out on a limb even in the Supreme Court to prevent this data from becoming public. This is the role of the media. Now, if the media does not play this role, then how else will the voter know what is really going on? Then you will just be talking about the things that they want you to talk about, which is Hindu-Muslim, polarization, etc.
And for people, please, I teach journalism students, I teach policy students, and every time they ask, ma'am, itna negative khabre kyun dikhate hain aap log? Please remember, people who are showing you only positive news are not doing you any service, because if you're doing public relations, you're not doing journalism. Our job is to ask questions to those in positions of authority and power, regardless of who belongs to which party. So I am not at war with the administration. I'm at work, as the Washington Post editor Marty Baron would say. Dr. Kaushik, now coming to, again, that CSDS data that we were talking about. In fact, the data, in one of the data sets, the question was that why do people want to re-elect Mr. Modi? 42% actually said that he has done good work. 18% said that there are benefits from welfare scheme. 10% said Modi is a great leader. 8% cited Ram Mandir. 6% cited removal of Article 370. and 4% talked about India's position in the global order increasing. 4% talked about Hindutva. For you, really, do you think in these last 10 years, the fact that the government still isn't facing a very strong anti-incumbency, are there welfare schemes that have really stood out? Is the economics of the scheme? Normally, we say that good economics doesn't make for good politics, but in this case, even if there is free ration that is being given out, even if there are free schemes that are being offered as welfare schemes, not freebies, because freebies apparently are dirty words. So, but they are translating into good politics. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes, so there is actually one work by Palishkar, Suhas Palishkar, who has looked at, obviously, the welfare that Modi government is doing in recent years is a very different kind of welfare scheme. There's a particularly targeting um, specific communities who might be in need. So, in this work, Palishkar notes that certain OBC, people have been found, and government has put a lot of money in welfare schemes, and that's what, like, in terms of cooking gas, and cooking fuel, and let me just um, open it. I have this data in front of me.
Sure.
So.
Talking about Subhash Palishkar, right?
Yeah, Suhas Palishkar. So households with electricity, for instance, in NFHS data 5 as compared to 1992 level, for instance, it has almost doubled. So the electricity connection, and even with respect to 2015-16 data, you find there has been almost 7% increase in the number of households with electricity. And then, toilet provision from 53% in 15-16 to 68.3%. Cooking fuel has been very significant, almost 16% increase in those numbers. So something is happening on ground, which is not, for the general middle class, let us say. And I think that has been a general perception, and also the reality. That's why you don't see too many freebies to the middle class. Tax cuts have not been there. Like, it is almost flat. Taxing for middle class and policies for middle class, but BJP has been able to find, welfare schemes for those people who are really at the margin, I think.
Hmm.
And that is what is happening on ground. So they are giving cash transfers also, in terms of
Hmm.
cash transfers, or in terms of these things. So these things change their lives. And this is something that is also not very, highly covered by media, I think. So,
Hmm.
there are things which media does, in terms of Hindu Muslims, obviously, I don't know. In most of the
Yeah.
TV channels that you see, it's Hindu Muslim, and we really get frustrated. That's why, but there are other things that are happening. So, there are both sides. Some things, for
Hmm.
example, electoral bonds and all, these should have been discussed at much more length. In fact, I'm working for last 10 to 15 days. I have been trying to work on a paper, which will probably
Hmm.
come in EPW in some time. So the political funding has been moving on in a zigzag position for
Hmm.
last 60, 70 years. So Indira Gandhi banning corporate funding to court, coming in and, changing the law, then government bringing up another law. So there has been a lot of movements in terms of political funding, but till date we have not found solution. And this
Hmm.
bond itself was, done. So to answer to your question, I think, for media, that also should have been, a concern. So this welfare scheme is
Absolutely.
happening on ground, but is not discussed much, as
Hmm.
against also, too many bad things which are also not discussed
But
at length.
Saptarshi, do you think that even in these delivery of welfare schemes that we talk about, I mean, there is Jan Dhan, there is direct transfer of benefits into bank accounts, there is Har Ghar Jal Yojana.
Anna Yojana,
The
yeah.
narrative that has been built, is there perhaps a difference between the delivery on the ground and what is being projected, or are these schemes that have really succeeded, which is why they have become popular and succeeded in terms of also breaking caste barriers?
Yeah, I think at least people like me who, I mean, I don't know, I think we do tend to underestimate the strengths of these schemes, because I think Professor is right. The media also doesn't cover it much, because hum bhi, matlab, what do we even have to cover unless like there is a scheme that is promised and it's not reaching? Like the story becomes big when you are promised a sack of rice, but you're given a sack of, well, an empty sack. But if the scheme is reaching you, we don't really tend to cover it much. And I think that is where often media, even independent media, might be going a bit wrong, because otherwise, where is the BJP getting the lower class and the lower caste vote? I mean, traditionally, it has always been perceived as an upper caste, pro-business corporate party, but
I
it
mean,
has,
it's broken that traditional NY
yeah,
votes that
it
we used to
has.
talk about, the Muslim Yadav combinations. It's managed
Exactly,
to break
exactly.
those
And I
stereotypical.
think, yeah, and given its leaders' inflammatory speeches or some of its parliamentary decisions, those are not supposed to break those barriers. Though I think what does break those barriers are these schemes. And you mentioned a couple of them. There's PMKGAY that was also extended for 5 years. Again, very like good timing. Like 5 more years, and then not just the extension, but the way the prime minister comes forward and sells it, Modi ki guarantee, or like I have come, this is my, the petrol ka price 2 rupees se reduce hota hai, and all the ministers go crazy and say, look, this is our prime minister's Diwali gift. Matlab, it's unbelievable. But like, and these are things. I was interviewing Subhash Garg, former finance secretary, once, when petrol prices, when I think LPG prices were reduced. And he said, this is not a subsidy at all, because it was sold as a subsidy. But he said, this is not a subsidy at all. International prices have come down. So, of course, domestic prices will come down. But the way the Mr. Puri came forward and said, this is the prime minister's gift, it is that sort of sale of, the Messiah idea that, look, I'm here, you all are my people. That is what works. And I think we do tend to underestimate that, because we get overwhelmed with the economy, corruption, and Hindu Muslim.
Dr.
Uh,
Kaushik,
yeah, I
and if you could just also answer while you add your point, because in that survey, 62% of youth are saying that finding a job today has become way more difficult compared to 5 years back. And unemployment remains the topmost issue. But there doesn't seem to be that anger on the road. It could be a silent vote, not an anger. Is there a demographic sort of a shift also that has happened in these last 10 years? Because women increasingly have been voting for Mr. Modi, and this is the first election where you have more than 50% voters. So the number of female voters are actually more than male voters. So is there also perhaps one or two very demographic trend or shifts that you would like to highlight along with the point that you wanted to add?
Yeah, so actually the previous one was not Palishkar, it was Milan Vaishnav. So that is a
Okay.
correction on my side.
Carnegie Endowment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Carnegie Endowment, yes. So, and the other one is about this demographic change. So I think in my observation, it is the introduction of youth voters. And youth voters, so for instance, the data shows that 1.98 crore new voters will be voting for the first time for Lok Sabha elections, which is almost 2.5% to 2.7% of the total. So, what BJP has been able to do is to have appealed to youth much more than the traditional supporters. So, the general commentary, and these are all opinions, so nobody knows when the voters go why they vote for BJP. But traditionally, the youth have been voting on different lines as compared to the older population. The youth have got huge smartphone penetration in their system, and if with that BJP has a different kind of how to say, the advertisement is very different. So when you see unemployment rising and it being a big problem, actually that is a problem not just in an informal one, but the formal one is also very bad. And in terms of all the premier institutions now reporting that the salary offers have reduced,
Right.
both in terms of proportion as well as the kind of salaries that they were receiving earlier. So this is a time, and this is not happening just in India, but around the world. Many countries are facing this kind of problem. So we used to say earlier that it is jobless growth. but now it is actually job lowering growth. So rather than jobless, it is actually reducing. Growth is there at top, but in terms of unemployment, it is falling. And it is a surprise actually why this is, yeah, definitely this is a problem that people mention,
Okay.
but it is not translating in
Okay,
terms
I'm
of.
just going to take one last question each from Shravasti and Saptarshi, because you can see a lot of halchal in the background. Chandrasekhar is about to set out of his house and I will have to be on his political trail too. Shravasti, I believe your video has gotten disconnected. If you're still on audio, I do want to ask you, what do you think is working in terms of the, the factor for Mr. Modi that is working with women voters, and especially in an election where you have more than 50% voters? What are the schemes that seem to have worked with them?
I think I'm sorry about my video issue, but as you mentioned, the women voters are of course a big constituency for Modi and for the BJP. We have seen that of the BJP's vote share, the women voters have increased their vote share in 2019 to almost 36% from about 25% in 2014. So that's a huge jump that has happened, and these are the schemes that have been attributed to, whether it's and most I would say the most popular scheme has been the Ujjwala Yojana scheme, which has, if you go and speak to people, women on the ground, they will say that they have benefited from it. Of course, in recent years, the prices have increased substantially, but Ujjwala Yojana remains one of the big flagship schemes of the Modi government that has brought in a lot of women voters. In addition, I would say that the Jan Dhan Yojana, which gives direct transfers to women's account, that has also helped women voters. We saw in the Madhya Pradesh elections, the Ladli Behna scheme, which saw cash transfers to women, that also gave the party an overwhelming support from women voters. And if you see now also, the number of women voters as well as the male voters are almost equal, and the BJP's policies are when it talks about Nari Shakti and women voters, their schemes are very targeted towards these women voters. They want to get the women voters vote, and the schemes are being crafted like that. Of course, we can go into a discussion about how successful they have been, how much funds have been utilized out of what was allotted, but the fact is that on the ground, these schemes are making a difference. And the fact that the campaigns are also crafted like that to make the women voter the center of the focus of the Modi government has worked to a certain extent, in my opinion.
Okay, one last question for you, Saptarshi, which is an audience question, which is, what is the role of social media in influencing these political opinions, especially for the voting population who are more on these platforms?
Short answer is everything. Social media plays a huge role. I mean, somebody was telling me, this government came to power on WhatsApp, and if it has to go, it will go on WhatsApp. I mean, of course, for us, I mean, Instagram and Twitter seems to be the go-to, but I think amongst the general populace, just that one WhatsApp forward plays such a huge role. And I think this is where fact checking and misinformation, that whole arena becomes even more crucial. It takes nothing. It takes a few minutes to make viral a completely false claim. And I think again the BJP has played that game really well. The Prime Minister tweeted even before 2014 that social media has become important and we have to capitalize on that. So Congress has started to understand that. Rahul Gandhi has been giving his interviews to social media influencers quite a bit, especially during Bharat Jodo, so that's encouraging to see. But yeah, the answer is, government came to power on social media, and if it has to go, it will go out on social media.
And this is an election where, of course, there are real dangers, remember, of AI, of fake news, of hate news, and the entire election. In fact, there are at least 40 countries that face elections. Well, I've been asked to move here. One last question that Sanjay Johari posted, and he said that also, should we hope that the Supreme Court, which has been giving bold verdicts, will intervene in the Arvind Kejriwal case on bail? I'm not going to crystal gaze. None of us are going to do that. The Supreme Court is supreme, but I think it's really to do with the complications of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act itself. And perhaps this case in the longer term may lead to some sort of a changes, especially when it comes to Section 45 and 50. That makes it so difficult to get bail in this case, even in peak election season for politicians who are unable to come out and campaign. So I'm going to end this discussion here. Thank you so much, Saptarshi, Dr. Sheikh, as well as Shravasti for joining here. I think the message is very clear for media, for traditional mainstream media, which should have been doing, of course, the job of asking questions. The discussions can be on mutton, machli, Mughal, but Manipur is missing. jobs are missing, unemployment, the crisis is missing. So I would suggest that please subscribe to independent journalism and journalist voices also. And this election is going to be very, very defining, because I think this will set the tone for the idea of India. It's not just about 2024, it's about where we are headed to as a country. Will the young who are frustrated with the job scenario remain silent or turn into angry voters? That only the polling dates and finally 4th of June will let us know. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you so much, all of you, as well as to Jindal Global University for hosting us for this conversation. I hope we were able to answer some of your questions. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Smita.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah, it was indeed a thought-provoking discussion. And as a sociologist, I certainly think that one has to engage and understand what is happening on the ground, and how people are preparing for election, campaigning, and most importantly, how common people are responding to the political developments that they are witnessing every day, and if that is going to change their decision to vote. So, on behalf of our constellation, politics, society, and history, and Ideas Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, I would like to thank Smita for moderating the session, Shravasti, Saptarshi, and Professor Arun for joining us today. Thank you very much. And we will start the next round table discussion on the state of Indian economy at 11:30. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
JGOAV, please start the recording.
Recording is in progress. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Avninder Thakur. By training, I'm a development economist. I teach here at OP Jindal Global University. So on behalf of Ideas, this is an interdisciplinary research outfit of OP Jindal Global University under the leadership of Professor Dipanshu Mohan. I welcome you all for the day's second panel discussion, which one already held before on general elections. And this panel discussion is, the theme of this panel discussion is the state of the economy on the eve of general elections. We are now heading towards 18 general election. So in the first panel discussion, we already introduced the ideas. So let me just talk about a bit about the constellation, the group of researchers which are working under the theme understanding the Indian economy, because the idea is actually grouped in the idea. There are different group of researchers which are basically working on broader themes. And one of those themes are understanding the Indian economy. And we call it constellation. And the constellation understanding of Indian economy basically aims to investigate various micro and macro issues of contemporary relevance, Indian economic growth and development. It also brings together meaningful research focusing on aspect of Indian economy, like, of course, not limited to poverty, inequality, economy from the historical perspective, how poverty, inequality in households and individual outcomes, labor market dynamics. So, and a broad structure of this constellation is like, there are core members, some are member associates who are either from the university or from the outside. There are some young researchers attached to those projects who are JRF, Junior Research Fellows. And we have also advisors, a group of advisors, eminent people as advisors. And some of the important topic questions which we are already started exploring upon are, for instance, is there any Indian school of thought, like visible or invisible hands, how the state created market in early neoliberal India, the biopolitics of data in India, how do caste and gender affect labor force participation in contemporary India, then analysis of debt in contemporary India, labor market inequalities, how do inheritance shape wealth inequalities, particularly the evidence from India, understanding household consumption expenditure, which is recently published, and whether there's a comparability with earlier release or not. Then we have estimating economic cost of terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. Some of these projects, of course, not limited. We are evolving. We are very keen to expand this research, and we also keen to invite people to attach to this research outfit as member associates or maybe advisors or JRFs. Okay, so yeah, so this is a first event of this constellation, understanding the Indian economy. And the idea behind hosting this kind of event is that we are already heading towards 18th general Lok Sabha election. And it's become very important then to track the trajectory of economic growth and development in the preceding debate, because already the third time the present government is contesting, basically claiming for the new government. So now we need to understand that to what extent the economic development and growth was achieved during the preceding decades. And in fact, if we talk about the existing data, some of the claims are there to show that the achievements were quite outstanding, significant. However, if you look at the other data, it says otherwise. So, in fact, some of those differences are observed in most important indicators like employment, inequality, poverty, just naming a few. Further, there is evidence also for deepening fault lines across social identities, such as caste, class, gender, and all. So all these plays out as India goes through its most productive phase with a sizable demographic dividend that will likely be run out soon. So in this context, I guess that is the broader context in which this panel discussion is there. And we basically, we want to have an opinion of our diverse panel, since the panel is quite diverse. So first, let me introduce the panelists here. We have with us Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who is a development economist, whose research and writings have had the most influence on issues such as labor, employment, skill development, and economics of education, just naming a few. It's a wide range. And he was an economic advisor in the United Nations system in New York, Italy, and Thailand. He's also a visiting faculty member at the University of Bath and also research fellow of ISA Institute of Labor Economics, Germany. We have with us Professor Surajit Majumdar. He's a professor at Center for Economic Studies and Planning, the School of Social Sciences, JNU. And of course, he was also earlier associated with Ambedkar University, Institute for Studies in Industrial Development, and Delhi University. His works is around macroeconomics and political economy. Then we have K. Sujata Rao with us, and he's a former Union Secretary of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. And her very long, 36 years long service as a civil servant, she spent nearly 20 years in the health sector, and both at the state and the federal level. So basically, she's an eminent public policy practitioner. And very welcome you, ma'am. And then we have M.K. Venu, a very eminent journalist and senior and well-known journalist. Over 40 years, he has been writing on Indian issues related to Indian economy and political economy landscape. There's no need to give further introduction of any of these panels. So I'm keeping it very brief because I'm very sure that our audience are very well aware of all of you. And now the structure of the panel discussion would be like, because we have a diverse panel and we have to take most out of it in a limited time frame. So we have a certain question to start with. And then each of you can take 8 to 10 minutes to highlight some of your core opinion on that, and then you can briefly comment on once the discussion is done. So each of you can have comments for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can have followed by some questions, and given a time limit, we'll attend some of the questions from the audience as well. So okay, so let me start with Professor Malhotra, if it's fine for you.
Of course.
So, okay,
sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, in fact, first, let's start with Professor Mehrotra, because when I'm looking at the employment aspect, for any developing country particularly, the structural transformation of the workforce is of prime importance. And it's basically, India also has reiterated this in many times in most of its literature and policy documents. In fact, very manufacturing policy, National Manufacturing Policy 2011 clearly states that India needs to improve its share of manufacturing from the current status was 16 to 17% to 25%, of course, and to create 100 million additional jobs in the manufacturing sector itself. So my first question is, I'm just putting 2 questions at the outset so that you basically put through discussions around that. The first question is, to what extent do you think for the last preceding debates, we have progressed in that respect? To what extent the target which was set in 2011 for 10 years, like we already passed that deadline, 2011 and 12. So to what extent we have progress in that respect, the first. And secondly, if we talk about like in official documents, just barring for COVID period, the economy's growth remained largely reasonable in official documents. However, in 2015, there was a modification in the methodologies. It faced a massive debate around that. But yet, going by numbers, it shows a reasonable growth in GDP. But however, if we look at its transcendence to the employment growth or growth in the decent employment, it's still questionable. So would you also highlight on the linkage between the growth and employment, which India has been witnessing for maybe a couple of decades, or maybe it's not a phenomena which is, only there in last decades. Maybe it has a longer horizon. But around these, I request Professor Malhotra to highlight some of your opinions. Maybe if it can be done in 10 minutes.
I can assure you that I will try and finish within 10 minutes. Let me start already by saying that your questions are most appropriate because my PPT actually does attempt to answer those. Let me just begin with my big ticket message, which is that the demographic dividend is slipping away. I think there is some impression among policymakers, academics, that our dividend is still around for a fairly long period of time. In fact, this has been reinforced by a recent book by Ajay Chibbar and Salman Soz, who talk about the dividend running till about 2050, which is not the case. In my estimation, we run out of our dividend in exactly another 15 years by the end of the 2030s, in fact, by 2040, which is not surprising given that China had reached a TFR of less than 2.1 in the year 1991, and exactly 20 years later, their TFR, their dividend ran out by about 2012 or so. Now, in our case, similarly, we've already hit in 2021 a TFR of 2, and we are going to reach the end of our dividend. By then, we'll become an aging society. So we have only 15 years more in which we can grow fast. So therefore, it's absolutely critical that we realize the demographic dividend. However, what are the, let me give you just the 5 takeaways from my presentation. Firstly, what's the reality? Before COVID, because one of the messages that keeps coming from the government is that, unemployment is already coming down. It has always been high. But before COVID, already unemployment was a 45-year high in 2017-18, and youth unemployment had tripled between 2012 and 2017-18. In other words, in a matter of 6 years. And no one can spread the narrative that Muslims, SCs, and STs are taking away jobs. Second takeaway is that the GDP growth rate has been lower in the last 10 years compared to 2004 to 14. I'm not going to bore you with the numbers. Everyone knows this. So fewer non-farm jobs have been created. As opposed to 75 lakh new non-farm jobs being created between 4 and 14, barely 29 lakhs have been created in the last 10 years or so. Third takeaway, on account of the slow growth in wages, slow growth in jobs, non-farm jobs. Please note, I only regard jobs as non-farm jobs, not agri jobs. We can discuss that if you're interested. And as a result of fewer, non-farm jobs being created, wages were already which were growing between 2004 and 14, as a result of which poverty came down. They have, in fact, even between 2013 and 17, they were relatively flat, and they have actually been flat or falling even for the last 5 years since COVID. And I mean, I have estimates which I won't show, which is sort of showing that workers earning below BPL wages is not only very high, and it's rising, it's over 62%. Third point, which answers to the point about structural change that Avnindra was talking about. Manufacturing, employment, and contribution of GDP was falling in the last 7 years is despite Make in India. It has only just recently recovered back to the 17% that prevailed between 1992 and 2014. And finally, there's been a reverse migration of historical proportions, which is causing severe rural distress. And that has actually combined with the manufacturing, employment, and GDP and contribution to GDP falling, it's led to a reversal of structural change. So let me quickly point out. As a result of this, it's not surprising that governments constantly selling a narrative of disinformation and misinformation. So let me very quickly tell you that unemployment rose. This is PLFS numbers from 2.2% to 6.1%, and youth unemployment tripled. And structural change has already been reversed. It was on its way. There's been a massive increase in agriculture. Employment rose from 42% in 2019 of the total to 45.5% in 22-23. And believe it or not, between 4 and 19, there was an absolute decline in the number of workers in agriculture. What we've seen is a 60 million addition in the last 4 years alone in the number of workers in agriculture. And the result of all of this is that the employment rate, unlike what the PLFS is telling us, has actually falling from 43% in 2016 to 37% according to CMI. And although most of my estimates are from the PLFS, I'll explain in a minute why I'm using here for the employment rate, the CMI data. So what's the kind of disinformation being spread? One, that the CMI data is trash. Despite the fact that the CMI has a larger sample size than NSO, it's covering organized and unorganized sectors, rural and urban. There are some issues with it. I have no problems in admitting that. However, on this dimension, they're fairly reliable. Let me move on. There's another the second claim by Professor Ramesh Chand. It has now been just reinforced 2 days back by Professor Amitabh Kundu, that NSO's PLFS since 2017-18 is not comparable to NSO's labor force survey for 2011-12 and earlier rounds. Despite the fact that the NSO's annual report itself compares 2017-18 to earlier rounds. A third claim is sort of equally interesting. It's by Bhalla, Virmani, Panagaria, etc. That 2017-18 to 22-23 NSO PLFS shows unemployment rate is falling, LFPR and WPR is rising. However, what they don't recognize, and as a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics for 3 years, we kept driving the point home to NSO, please make your definitions internationally compliant. CMI's data is internationally compliant, definitions are internationally compliant, and the Sarkar's data, PLFS data, is not. What has happened, in fact, is the reason why LFPR, WPR seems to be rising is because primarily on account of unpaid family labor and rising informality and a falling regular employment. So if you eliminate unpaid family labor, as CMI does, and CMI data is internationally compliant, WPR, LFPR falls and it's not rising. Okay. Next, there's more disinformation which I could go about. Your GDP has returned to pre-20 COVID levels without, how can it be without employment having recovered? Well, bottom line is GDP can recover due to the organized sector recovering without unorganized sector recovery, and MSME is not recovering. We know that it's not a V-shaped recovery, it's a K-shaped recovery. Another claim is, of course, EPFO is showing new registration in EPFO is rising, so formal jobs are rising. Ghosh keeps making this point, the Prime Minister and the FM keep repeating, formality may rise, but not jobs. Also, even formality may not have risen because EPFO constantly keeps revising down, up. Without a true unique identity number in the EPFO, you can never be sure that the EPFO is actually telling you what the employment situation is. Anyway, I'm going to just show you some pictures now, and I'll be done in the next 2 minutes, I assure you. Look at this. This is showing you open unemployment rates for youth between 15 and 29. Now, this is by education level. I'll just focus here on, you see the first bar, which is the blue bar, it's showing 2011-12, and the highest bar is 2017-18. But even though it's coming down thereafter, the point is it's still very high. Postgraduates, which is, many of the students who are probably listening to us, it was 18%, but it doubled, in 2020, and it has come down since then, but not very much. So point is, overall youth unemployment had more than, doubled. It was 2.5 times higher, and it's still twice as high as it was. And this is Sarkari data. As it was in 2012. Next, I told you that real wages were in fact increasing between 4 and 11. This is rural, this is rural, this is urban. And you can see between 4, 5 and 11, 12, those were increasing. This is regular salary. This is for casual labor. It's increasing between 4, 5, 11, 12, and then it flattens out. In all of these cases, it tends to flatten out. If you want to see what happens after 2017, well, here's a more detailed one. Agriculture, you've got you've got 2 bars here, self-employed and casual labor, pretty much flat all the way, except for casual labor in the most recent. Average wages across from before COVID to post-COVID. This is manufacturing, flat. For all 3 types of earnings or wages, self-employed, regular, casual. Construction, similar, flat or falling. And finally, services, you can see, again, flat. So non-farm jobs not growing. Why are we surprised that real wages are completely flat? So finally, if the demographic dividend runs out, we are in big trouble. I mean, there are 3 demographic groups which need jobs today, and each of them is a looming crisis. The first, of course, consists of the farmlandless and the small and marginal farmers. We know that we already had too many workers in agriculture, 200 million in 2019, producing 15% of the country's GDP, and that actually increased by 60 million. So we've got to pull millions out of agriculture. Second, youth joining the labor force, much better educated, about 6 million joining every year. And a subgroup of that is, of course, girls. Labor force participation rate of girls has been falling. And finally, of course, the stock of unemployed. 3 massive groups, each a jobs looming crisis. However, what's the narrative? And this is my last slide. What's the narrative which is being put out? Oh, fast-growing part of new India, new economy. It's a narrative put out by Morgan Stanley, S&P, etc., HSBC, and which says, oh, what are the fast-growing parts of the new India, new economy? They comprise 2 high-tech goods and services sectors: mobile handsets, pharma, auto, IT services. And India is gaining global market share since 2017. Fine, no problem. Within IT services, India is no longer a giant call center as it was in the 90s, or a software services provider as it was in the 2000s. It's become global. It's become a hub of global capability center for service delivery for MNCs. These will grow now. Surely, of course they will. No one's denying that. The second high tech is due to digital public infrastructure on account of India stack. Tech startups have plugged into all of this India stacks. They're spreading across fintech, e-commerce, edtech, logistics, and they've attracted foreign capital. Now, point is, if these sectors grow, the GDP is still expected only to expand by 6.5% per annum over the next decade. Not one international agency expects during this decade that we will be growing at more than 6.5% per annum. Now, 6.5 is still higher than the 6% pre-COVID, which would only double GDP in 11 years. Yes, we would become the 3rd largest, but we are still 142 in the rank in per capita income terms, and even PPP 124. So this is clearly not enough to create enough jobs they are themselves saying it would generate only 1/3 of the jobs needed. And besides, the new economy is only 15% of the total economy. What about the 85% of the old economy? Who's going to pull that along? New India can barely energize old India. So let me finish with this, because really there is a structural crisis despite the narrative of the fastest growing large economy. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Malhotra, for very insightful and very brief account of everything. I'm also excited to have more conversation on that, but we'll get back to you later, maybe. Let's move to our second speaker, Professor Surajit Majumdar. So let me set up a small context around that. So basically, if we talk about the preceding decades, so many changes happened. So naming a few, like implementation of GST, demonetization, shifting of planning commission to Niti Aayog, tax reforms. In fact, the center-state relations, financial relations, and of course, other kind of relations also changed substantially. So, and it was said that in the name of better deliveries, better kind of facilitating growth and inclusive growth. So first question is, to what extent do you think so those changes were aligned to achieve the target of inclusive growth? That was the first one. And second, if we talk about the recent data, problem of unemployment, inflation, as also highlighted by Professor Malhotra, the inequality, of course, recent report is also saying that inequality is rising. So, what do you think should be the macroeconomic priorities of the new government? What should be the agenda to fight the election? What should be the new priorities of the new government in this regard? Do you suggest some major changes also? Would you please, yeah.
Thank you, Avanindra. And well, let me begin by saying this, that the relationship between economic realities and what happens in elections is a complex relationship with causal factors operating both ways. But I think one of the important challenges that needs to be addressed, okay, in relation to the future of the Indian economy, is the extreme levels of inequality that have come into being, okay, and its underlying causal factors or structural factors, which is high degree of wealth concentration on one side and mass unemployment and underemployment on the other. This is a central problem that I think has to be addressed, because there is every sign that, in a sense, we have reached a kind of a dead end. Okay. An attempt to kind of insert yourself into the global economy and grow on the basis of what is conventionally called export-led growth. Okay. That, okay, you maintain cheap wages or low wages for a period of time, and that allows you to grow on the basis of labor-intensive exports. On course of time, unemployment increases and wages can also start going up. Okay. What we have had is a situation where we've not got that export-led growth. On the other hand, maintaining the conditions which give rise to low wages is not allowing us to exploit our own domestic potential also for growth. And that's the kind of dead end we have seem to be reaching in. Now, it's actually for a long period of time, there have been signs of the Indian economy being in an extremely sluggish phase. Okay. But if you look at the statistics about the Indian economy and the data about the Indian economy, it doesn't always reveal this when you look at things on the face of it. But within that data itself is often concealed a reality which can be got out once you look at the data differently. So let me give an example. Professor Malhotra talked about the issue about so-called increase in employment that is shown by the PLFS data from 2017-18 to 2020-23. So according to that data, it suggests that employment increased in India in this period by 25%. Okay, total employment increased by 25%. If you look at national accounts data, from that you can deduce that the capital stock of the economy in that same period increased by 37%. But in that same national account statistics data, GDP increased by 22%. So GDP increased by 22%, employment increased by 25%, capital stock increased by 37%. Now, even if you took that data to be correct, it would be this indicating that this is an economy in serious trouble. Okay, where even both you are accumulating labor, you are putting people to work, you are accumulating capital, but you're not getting a return in terms of output growth. Okay, so these are all official statistics which are indicating that this is there. But I'm saying if you look at it even in a longer term, you refer to the 2015 GDP series, and of course, all the attention has been on the question of the overall growth rate of the economy and what that is being indicated. But if you look at within those trends, so from 2011-12 onwards, if you see, there are several signs that the economy is not really on an economy that has lost momentum. So you have what you look at when you look at investment. The investment ratio has fallen significantly over a sustained period of time. An unprecedented decline which you've never seen before in the history of independent India, that's such a long period of decline in the investment ratio. You look at India's trade, that has also been stagnating, and its significance relative to GDP has been on the decline in the post-2008 global crisis world. That has also declined. You look at the industrial sector, okay, you have had a long period of now industrial stagnation. You look at industrial productivity even in the organized sector is stagnating. Even organized sector industrial employment growth has slowed down considerably compared to what it was earlier. You look at the construction sector, you can see slowdown. You look at bank credit and other forms of credit to non-financial sector trends relative to GDP, you see again that there's an indication of stagnation. And of course, you look at employment and the employment structure together, as Professor Mehrotra did, you can see all of these are clear signs of an economy that is facing serious difficulties in sustaining its momentum of growth. Okay, we are a low middle income economy. We entered that status in 2007. So we are very far from even upper middle income status. Forget about high income. Okay, we are not even halfway to upper middle income status from lower middle income threshold. We are in the bottom half of that. So these are not the macroeconomic features that you should be expecting in an economy that is moving up that particular ladder. So clearly, there are serious difficulties of a deeply embedded nature in the Indian economy, which need to be addressed. However, for most of this period of more than a decade, since 2011-12, preoccupation as far as policy has been concerned has two broad characteristics. One is there is this constant process of trying to restore the so-called fiscal balance, which had been disturbed in the as a result of the post-2008 fiscal stimulus after the 2008 global crisis. Over the whole period, it has never, till COVID came, they had not succeeded in bringing it back to 2007-8 levels. Okay. And after COVID, again, there is a return to that same thing. That COVID year, there was again a rise in the fiscal deficit, and the preoccupation again has been towards reducing that particular thing. And the second is, of course, various schemes which are designed to try and encourage private corporate investment to and promote the animal spirits of private corporate investment. But neither of these has happened. Okay, it has not produced any results because there is a structural reality that is there, that you essentially have a problem that if you have such mass level of unemployment, okay, that ensures that 90% of the Indian population faces a problem of income stagnation because they have no other means other than work from earning their income. Okay, so you don't have, as a result of that, a domestic market on the basis of which growth can happen. If their supply of cheap labor is not sufficient for Indian enterprises to become extremely competitive and export their way out of this problem, then you are neither here nor there. Okay, and that's the problem that is there. And if your fiscal policy approach is simply to try and reduce the deficit while maintaining low taxes, try and give tax concessions in order to promote private investment, then you're not really going to be addressing this structural inequality that is there. So if you have now the signs that this process is reaching a dead end, okay, the dead end also means that you are creating a social condition, socio-economic condition in which essentially for the privileged part of Indian society, it is no longer going to be possible for them to grow and expand without that happening at the expense of others, in the sense, not just a relative sense, but an absolute sense. And you've seen this post-COVID, that there has been an improvement in the top sections, but it's the rest of the population, the working population, which has been made to adjust to actually a lower level of income. Okay. And these signs of this problem are there even in the present. So the latest GDP figures tend to suggest that you're growing. You've grown at 7.5% or 7.6%. Okay. But that's on a nominal growth of 9.1%. You're assuming an inflation rate of just 1.5% when the consumer price index is 6%. Okay. So you're actually, the pace of expansion is slowing down. The basis for expansion, which is investment, that is slowing down. You're really not getting any real quality employment being generated. Okay. So what does that mean? That it's basically a cake in the sharing. One part of society can expand or benefit only by reducing the share of the other. Okay. So in a sense, to put it simply, the rich can become richer only by making the poor poorer. You're almost at that point. If that has to be then addressed, then there has to be measures which, firstly ensure some level of autonomy in relation to the global economy. Particularly, you have to address the issue of an open capital account, because that is what is required to create the space for using fiscal policy, not as a means of simple redistribution, take from the rich, give to the poor, but as an instrument of intervention to address the structural realities, which will allow expansion of economic opportunities, which are in a manner which generates employment and allows people to gain more from participation in economic activity, rather than creating a situation where, because some people are better off, you can take a little bit of revenue from them and give different kinds of support to the rest of the population, which becomes dependent on this support rather than participation in economic activity in order to even sustain themselves. So the important issue challenge then is to be able to address these structural features underlying inequality, because now they have become severe barriers to any process of economic expansion, where the cake that is available to be shared is in a real sense going to be expanding. Notionally, you can have the financial sector, etc., expanding and your GDP growth rate happens. But if you look at the goods producing sectors, you can see what's the state of affairs, that even in the official statistics, you can see that the goods producing sectors are actually doing extremely badly. So I think this is the real challenge that is there. And one hopes that in some form or the other, the debate in the elections and the results that it lead to will force whoever comes to look at and examine this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mazumdar. So putting it larger issues concerning Indian economy and challenges and all. So we'll get back to you once we listen to all our panelists. So, okay, so Mr. Rao, so maybe about your work. So what I was thinking about, if we talk about social sector, that's very important, particularly health, because with the outbreak of COVID, health became kind of came in the central of the development discourse. And particularly, it's very important for a country like India, tropical country where prevalence of many kind of diseases are very high, out-of-pocket expenditure is also very high. And then given the level of mass education and awareness, basically, it becomes even more grave. The situation becomes even grave. So, but if we talk about national health policy, which in 2017, which clearly talks about the challenges and aims to achieve universal access to good quality healthcare services without anyone having to face financial hardship. So it clearly talks about inclusive healthcare system, so publicly financed. So to what extent, my first question is, like last decade, to what extent we have actually progressed towards providing a universal healthcare system? Well, of course, it's very difficult to provide it in a very short span of time, but how far we have progressed in that regard, first. And second question is, after COVID outbreak, of course, many countries realized their limitations. And of course, they understood the importance of healthcare expenditures. And some of the countries definitely reoriented its policy discourse completely in favor of increasing the share of public expenditure on healthcare and also education and that. So what extent do you think the India also reorient its policy discourse in favor of such expenditures and all? What has been the status of the economy, particularly progress for maybe last decade, and what challenges do you see for the new government? What kind of structural changes, what kind of basic fundamental changes you suggest in that regard?
Thank you, Abhinanda. I'm feeling very awed in the presence of such eminent economists who have, it's so bad. The situation is so bad that the little hope I had that health will come back to the table seems to be slipping, like the demographic dividend. So that's a depressing way of starting my little response to you. But, regarding COVID, your second question, has there been a change in prioritization? I mean, what the country went through, all of us know, the trauma that we went through. 45 lakh people died. And it was a substantial amount of, suffering that people faced. I mean, you all know it much better than I do. So I personally did expect that in the latest budget, there would be a serious effort to say, no, health, we've paid a big price. This is not going to be neglected anymore. And we're going to invest much, much more and, bring it back center stage to what I call the development theory that we might be having. But then that didn't happen. That didn't happen at all. In fact, even the so-called increase they showed in health budgets was very nominal, less than inflation. So in real terms, hardly any increase at all. The only thing that COVID did was to probably get Government of India to borrow another $65 million from the World Bank for strengthening the district hospitals and those Ayushman Bharat facilities, and also establish district-level laboratories and strengthen institutions like NCDC and so on. Apart from that, there has been no reprioritization. There has been no attempt to try and bring back reform and so on and so forth. In fact, what is very depressing about India is no matter what happens, I mean, what more could have happened to this country to shake us up, to say health is very important. I mean, it has taken us so long for us to recognize that health is central to development, health and education. If you look at it from the human capability angle, I mean, when the previous speakers talked about unemployment and GDP and all, to hell with GDP, how does it matter to me whether it's 7 or 7.2% when your per capita is so miserably low that they're not able to consume health or buy any basic necessities? How the hell does it matter to me if the third trillion, I mean, 5 trillion economy, third highest in the world, when you have 37% of your children stunted or malnourished? So there is a way of looking at your economic indicators, and from the personal, household, individual point of view, it's not a happy picture. So, no matter what, I mean, except giving a false sense of pride that, oh, we are so powerful that we have beaten Japan. I mean, what does it mean? It's so silly. It's such an infantile argument, because Japan, look at their quality of life and look at ours. So that, this kind of a dismissive attitude to health is largely because overall, we've always looked at health as a welfare expenditure item. So when you give away subsidies to big industries or corporates and give away subsidies to other economic groups, it is seen as an investment where, they will create employment, they'll create jobs. And so that's how you incentivize them to do better for the country's growth. But when you have health or education, the investment is really seen as a welfare item. And, it's not at all given any importance. It's not. Now, the first time some importance came was with Jeffrey Sachs, Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, where with evidence they were able to establish that, there is a linkage between development and health. Now, coming back to your earlier question of UHC, 2009, this whole concept Rockefeller propagated on the universal health coverage. Now, universal health coverage has embedded in it the concept of rights, fundamental right to health. It is an entitlement-oriented concept. And so, therefore, it is a very powerful concept also. Now, what has it done in the last 10 years? UHC has been largely translated as an insurance program, social insurance program, which started with Rajshekhar Reddy in 2008, where 85% of Andhra population was covered with social insurance. Now we have Ayushman Bharat, where 500 million people are sort to be covered. But then the main objective of any UHC is that your out-of-pocket expenditures come down. Now, we were 73% out-of-pocket expenditures in 2004 when NRHM was being launched. From there, we have reached, according to the World Bank, this is World Bank data that I am quoting, we have now come down to about 54% is out-of-pocket expenditures. And do you know that during COVID, due to all the social health insurance programs having collapsed, the health system having collapsed, the public and the private, and the amount of price gouging that the private sector resorted to in exploiting patients, and you saw what havoc was played, and the state not willing to control or regulate this kind of behavior, we ended up with more than 61. One study shows 61% was the out-of-pocket expenditures immediately after COVID, which means a 7% rise in out-of-pocket expenditures. And this is all coming from households. And I'm sure if you study the income groups, it is the poorer people who faced about almost 38% of catastrophic. Catastrophic means 25% of your income goes in health, or 10% of your non-food income goes on health, is termed as catastrophic expenditure. And that was felt much more intensely by the poorer groups than the richer ones. Richer groups faced about 20% catastrophic expenditure, but the poorer classes, the quintile 5, faced about 37% of catastrophic expenditure. Now, this was a level of poverty that COVID induced an already sad situation. So this is, and then you look at it from what the newspapers recently said, 40% houses indebted. Now, how much of it, that indebtedness, is due to health? If one goes deeper into that and sees how much of it is due to debt, because this indicates a failure of the state. During a pandemic, the state failed to come to the citizens' rescue. Nothing else can explain. Normally, okay, but during a pandemic, we should have gone all out to see that they didn't have to face this problem. So, first of all, COVID didn't really get us to prioritize. Second, your question of UHC, how have we done? We do have a social health insurance program there. We do have the Ayushman Bharat, where they're trying to strengthen primary healthcare facilities, giving 12 guarantees, free of cost, universally available. But there are so many gaps. There's so many gaps. They say mental health, for example. There's no counselor. There's no psychologist. There's no psychiatrist. There are no drugs there. So, it's work in progress. So the point here is, if you really want to be able to implement even that Ayushman Bharat vision of health and wellness clinics, you need at least 1% GDP to be able to strengthen that level of primary care, without which you really cannot have a UHC. Now, my final point is that what are the challenges? The challenges are the ideologies of the political parties that we are facing. Let's take these two, Congress and BJP. Neither of them did very much for health, so I have no love lost for either of them. Okay, something Congress did, UPA did on NRHM, very nice. And for the same matter, BJP also has given some money for health and wellness clinics. And both have done the social health insurance but then neither of them have really brought out a concept of, reforming and re-strategizing and redoing the health system in the changed circumstances of disease burden changing. Any health system has to respond to the kind of disease burden that you have. Today, we have much more of non-communicable diseases of chronic nature. So your health system has to respond to long-term care, not an episodic care, and so on. So none of them have brought this reform package, which I find that 10 years is a long time. Both Thailand and Turkey brought about transformational changes within 10 years. So I don't believe that neither UPA or NDA have any excuse to have not been able to bring about that fundamental transformational change in health. And why I say ideologies matter is largely because, I mean, if I'm taking time, please do take time because I keep on talking otherwise. Yeah. So, is because BJP essentially believes in the market. They believe in private sector. And, they don't necessarily believe, I mean, they're trying to be a welfare state, but essentially they are energizing and incentivizing the private sector investment, not so much on the public sector side. Whereas Congress does believe in the right to health. It's a rights approach. They did it for right to education, right to food, right to employment, and so on. So they'll be happy to say right to health. But then the issue before both, to be fair to them, is that where is the money going to come from? It's easy to say from 1%, we have to increase it to 2.5% GDP, or we have to increase it to 3% GDP. But where is the money coming from? Because out of that 1 rupee of money available, almost 60% is committed liabilities, and so on and so forth. And if you see the layers of subsidies that they have to give, the window available for either of the governments to really increase in the present structure of the economy. I mean, if you're going to radically redo the structuring of the economy and public finances from the people's point of view, yes, then you will find money. I don't say that you won't. But then at the current status, the way we are going about doing our investments, they will never be able to increase more than the 1%, which has dogged us for the last 70 years. So what I mean by this is that in terms of budgetary resources, yes, there has been phenomenal increase. 10,000 crores was my budget in 2004-09. Today, it's 90,000 crores. But in terms of proportion to GDP, it hovers around 1%, 0.9 to 1.2% of the GDP. So this is my only thing is that there's a plethora of recommendations available on what the challenges are, what we need to do. But whatever we do, whether it is incentivizing, having a public-private mix in delivery of services, and having a social health insurance net, we do have to invest much more resources. And why I say this is, despite such a social health insurance program, if there is still so much of out-of-pocket expenditures, the weakness is in the design of the insurance program, which does not cover outpatient treatment. They only give money for hospital episodes. But the main expenditures, and particularly if it is chronic diseases like diabetes or hypertension, you won't be hospitalized. But you're every day spending money on buying those drugs, insulin or so, whatever it is. So, therefore, this, unless they tackle the outpatient treatment of, covering the drugs and diagnostics, which is 50% of your outpatient treatment, I'm afraid UHC will not be a realizable goal. And the second thing, when I said ideologies, as I can see from the past record of BJP, they're very centrist in attitude, not so federal. Whereas, not only in the size of healthcare, but any healthcare cannot but have to have communities as active participants of your health trajectory, and you have to have decentralized models. That's what every country has shown. So I'm afraid federalism, decentralization, participation of local bodies, all these are very critical aspects which will not need to necessarily get into their dialogue. And finally, I would say, while the government investments are static and stagnant, if not in real terms falling, you have the private sector which is booming. Till a few years ago, the private sector was growing at the rate of 15% CAGR. Today, from 2016, it is growing at 22% CAGR. While the COVID, the whole economy tanked to minus what, 7% GDP, you had your pharma industry booming at 15 to 20% growth. So, health is a VIP sector. Always the sun is rising there. But the point is that it creates a lot of distortions in its way. Now the government is encouraging medical tourism, for example. That's 3%, $3 billion worth. They want to go to 10 billion. But what does it mean when your supply is not growing in keeping with the demand of domestic demand? You're creating an external demand, At the same time, you're not improving your supply position. It means the substitution effect is coming. Instead of treating the Indian patient, the best services are going to the high-paid foreign patient. But having said all this gloomy scenario, I do feel that investment in health still makes sense, because it's not only the wellness of the people, but more importantly, it has huge employment potential. It's a real sector for employment. The more diagnostics, more technicians you need, more nurses you need. With aging population, much more demand has come in externally also for export of nurses and technicians and technical skilled forces for doing home care and so on and so forth. So I think there's a huge employment potential in the health sector. So I do hope that we become a sunrise sector and stay a sunrise only, and not downers back again into the dark abyss. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Roy. You have actually given a wonderful, it's a wonderful analysis, put together almost all major issues which are there. So I think, thank you very much. In fact, you rightly said that, if we look at the public expenditure GDP ratio on health, it has not changed significantly, though it had some fluctuations in between, but largely it remained the same for last maybe 3-4 decades.
Yeah.
And also, like, in the COVID period, it was denial which was more problematic. So first you need to accept the challenges, then you can only move forward. Yeah. So if you deny things, then it becomes even more difficult to work on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. So now let's move towards our last speaker, Mr. Menu. So actually, I was thinking about, if I quite remember that 2014 election when it was fought around the significant narrative of prevailing inefficiencies in the system. And it was claimed that it was mainly deep-rooted in corruption. Yeah. And it was the main discourse of the NDA campaign at that point of time, that minimum government and maximum governance. So is the mantra of inclusive and corruption-free system. So my question is, how far, because corruption has definitely been in limelight for many of things, whether it's ED, CBI, or maybe institutional changes, demonetization, everywhere it was there. So my question is, to what extent we, the last 10 years was successful in bringing a good governance, corruption-free governments, or a delivery system became much inclusive in that sense? So that's something which is my fundamental query. And secondly, do you really think some of the changes were not in accordance with, were not actually productive? So if you have to recommend that, what kind of institutional changes, proper institutional changes, which could facilitate better delivery system or corruption-free system, or maybe better inclusive system. So what's your suggestion in that regard for an upcoming government? Yeah, thank you.
So good questions. Yeah. And there are very, very stark answers to your questions also. Answers which are which can't be disputed at all. Evidence wise, they can't be disputed. So I'll begin with two or three key slogans of Mr. Modi in 2014. The slogans on which he rode to power. One, of course, was that he'll deliver corruption-free governance. Within that, I would like everybody to recall, he promised that for political cases, for cases relating to politicians, he would have a fast-track court, and he will have a special dispensation, which included Lokpal also. And we know what kind of Lokpals have got created in the last 10 years. So he spoke about a lot of structural changes in regard to dealing with corruption. And what we have seen in the last 10 years is no fast tracking of political cases have happened. On the contrary, all political cases are being used as a tool of blackmail to subvert democracy. Which is happening before our eyes, right? All you need to do is look at some key examples, and that the Indian Express big investigation, which everybody might have read 2 weeks ago, which said that among all the cases that were ongoing against politicians. A large number of cases where politicians joined the BJP were withdrawn. So we have a system which is selectively targeting corruption, and the targeting is that of the opposition. And so brazenly, like in the most recent examples are those of Congress bank account being frozen on account of very frivolous income tax notices, which income tax is not a criminal offense. You can pay 300% of the penalty, and you can which was offered by the Congress party, and those similar issues existed with the BJP also, which the Congress party raised in public and from public platform, that income tax was selectively targeting Congress, and selectively opposition sitting chief minister being sent to jail. So and all those as we speak, many candidates from the opposition who are being declared as candidates in certain seats, ED cases are being launched against them. I don't need to elaborate on this. This is something which is happening with in the most I would say the most transparent fashion. on this BJP has been the most transparent, actually. If you see the electoral bonds case, it's becoming very clear that the way funding of BJP, bulk of the funding was done. In fact, I did a report analysis based on a Hindu study at the Hindu newspaper. The loss-making companies, 75% of the funding from loss-making companies of electoral bonds came to the BJP. The amount was huge. It was about, I think, 530 crores coming from loss-making companies, and this was not envisaged at all. And if you recall, when the Supreme Court was hearing the electoral bonds case, the Chief Justice of India spent considerable time on this question, where he asked the attorney, the Solicitor General, government representative, what will happen if loss-making companies, start, shell companies start proliferating, and through loss-making shell companies, the political parties are funded. There will be no transparency. You'll never know who's behind those loss-making shell companies. And I remember the Solicitor General, in the course of the arguments, he admitted before the court, and he told Chief Justice Chandrachud that yes, loss-making companies should not be allowed to fund political, and that's exactly what has happened as details are coming out. So I'll make a broader point, which is none of the promises of structural transformation, institutional transformation in regard to dealing with corruption have been even seriously considered. In fact, I would say this regime has most cynically dealt with this whole issue that we are talking about, institutional transformation to deal with corruption, and they have allowed corruption to continue, and they have allowed precisely because it suited them to let corruption continue, because they had the instruments of the investigation, all the instruments of power, investigation agency, and they chose to just selectively target the opposition, and they, it stands to sort of, it's logical that they won't launch cases against themselves. So this is what has happened in the last 10 years in regard to corruption, and in regard to the big promise of institutional transformation. And here, I'd like to raise a very important political economy issue, which not only affects our economic development, our economic growth framework. It also simultaneously strikes at the root of the way we conduct elections, of the way we conduct our democratic processes, which is these shell companies. If you remember, the problem with shell companies is, if you remember the entire Adani episode, in a nutshell, I mean, it's not just Adani, it's all other big companies. Crony capitalism in India is predicated on the existence and the nurturing of conscious nurturing of shell companies in India and abroad, where you do not know who the real people are behind those shell companies, and these shell companies are used to bring money back, to take money out through over invoicing of imports. It's an issue which the Supreme Court has also looked at. Which our judiciary has looked at this issue and not been able to do anything. SEBI is looking at it, and SEBI has also thrown up its hands and changed its regulation after realizing that there's no way you can find out who the real people behind shell companies are. These shell companies are used to take money out of India. They're used to bring money back through the market routes, which we all know was the basis of a large part of what the Hindenburg report also spoke about. I'm not necessarily talking about one company. These are broad institutional maladies, and the electoral bonds case and the information that has come out from the electoral bonds from the Election Commission, which SBI very reluctantly was asked to, shows that shell companies are alive and thriving, and it shows that we cannot do anything about shell companies, and it also shows that, by the way, there is a structural problem with the way our companies act is formulated. In fact, I remember covering the several big changes in the Companies Act through the UPA regime also, and I'm not exonerating the UPA government here. And this big issue came up as to why do Indian corporates, run their companies or their main company or run their group through 600 underlying subsidiaries at various levels. There are 5, 6, 7 layered structure of ownership, where on the face of it you'll find that a big corporate is owned by a certain holding company and by a certain family. But if you go deeper, there are like 500, 600 shell companies. And this has been investigated and written about. All these shell companies have a single address, which is the company's main address. So these, now what happens is these multi-layered, multi-layered structure through which shares are held. Now these may not be shell companies; these are genuine companies, but they're used to hold shares, and you never get to know who the real owner of these companies are. It could be individuals, it could be a company's associate, a promoter's associate, some distant family member, it could be some friend, it could be some senior employee also, as was revealed in the case of some companies in the electoral bonds case, where the companies were actually run by some senior employees, trusted employees. So these kinds of very, very opaque system of ownership of Indian corporates has really, in my view, has helped perpetrate, even consolidate the crony capitalist framework. And I recall Mr. Modi at the G20 summit back in, I think, 2015 or 16. He made a big announcement that he's going to, that this government made a big announcement that they were seriously going to attack these non-transparent, shell companies from which are established in tax havens, and how in real time, Mr. Modi once said that money going out of the company, going into some tax haven, shell company, and coming back, they would be tracked real time, and the perpetrators would be brought to book. Now, all these promises were made, and mind you, at a very institutional level, whether it was Lokpal or whether it was tackling political corruption through fast-track courts, or through promising in G20 that money is sloshing about in tax havens and coming back into the country, going out of the country, would be tracked very, very diligently by the agencies. Part of that was also, tackling black money, which was for which we had to suffer demonetization. That was also, they still claim that it was a structural transformation move. Although the BJP has stopped mentioning demonetization, they didn't mention it in the white paper or more recent documents do not mention of achievements, do not mention the demonetization. And so that broadly is the story of the way governance has panned out. And particularly in regard to economic governance, one more point I want to make. The competition, India's Competition Commission needs a massive overhaul. We need to align ourselves in our competition policy with some of the key, some of the more stringent and some of the more rational framework that the European Competition Commission adopts, which is not happening because we are now seeing, in the last 10 years, we've seen individual groups, forming near monopolies or at least oligopolies. There are sectors where 2 or 3 companies, they control, 60-70% of the market. All kinds of things are going on, and our competition commission has not really been able to study the rise of the rise of dominance in regard to market share in many areas. Now there's a problem. I tell you why that has happened, because when UPA, when this commission came during UPA, I remember speaking to Monte Ahluwalia once, and he told me at a conceptual level, he said, India is too small. Indian corporates are very small compared to the size of global fellows. So it may be a bit early for Indians to start looking at the growing size of our corporations and start looking at their whether they are whether there would be abuse of dominance. Now this he told me some 15 years ago, but now as we see, some of our corporates are growing to fairly large, they're building scale, which compare with some of the other emerging market peers. So we need to have a serious look at competition policy, at potential abuse of dominance, etc. And this is part of, I would say, very important part of structural transformation that we need. And part of this also, I'll just finish my final thing would be, because of this focus of this government on letting the big organized sector, there has been a sharp bias towards the organized sector. There is no doubt, and I don't think this government even hides their bias towards the organized sector. In fact, they have openly, as matter of policy, they have said we are creating national champions. So then there are, say, 7, 8, 10 national champions, companies, groups, which they want. This government wants them to grow their size and scale in order to compete globally. And in the process, they are not really looking at what this national champion, policy is doing to competition domestically. So there's a big problem there. And while doing this, the policy has been very skewed towards them. And one of the results of this K-shaped policy is that they have post-COVID, even before that, post-demonetization, GST, and COVID, these 3 events have really hit the small, medium sector very badly. And as Santosh Mehrotra has said, all their achievements that they're talking about, they relate to the big organized sector, and their growth has been fine. But the rest of the small, medium sector is struggling. Their output has also shrunk post-COVID, post-demonetization, and I think we need a white paper on this, on this K-shape. The government is somewhat in denial about K-shape. Now, the interesting thing is the entire private sector admits to K-shape. If you see the Mumbai equity research, all the economists from the private equity research firms, they talk about K-shape, but the government is in denial about the K-shape. I think we need a serious study of this K-shape, and we need to figure out this organized versus the unorganized informal sector. What's going on? This cannibalization in the K-shape, the organized sector is actually taking away the businesses that was erstwhile market share held by the medium industry. And I see this on this business channel on a daily basis. You know, the CEO of say construction companies like DLF or Godrej, or the CEO of Bata India, they actually they come and say as an achievement that they've got a lot of market share from the unorganized sector, and it's been a good period for them. The organized real estate companies are doing very well, 30% growth, etc. But if you go to the unorganized the real estate space, all the smaller companies are either dead or dying. So I think these things in the when you look at the transformation, institutional transformation, all these points that I've made so far, they need very, very close scrutiny, and I don't think that's happening. Any new government will have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Venu. It's really insightful. In fact, I think that it's easier to tap the corporate when its size is not too big. Once it becomes too big, it's really difficult to control them. It happens everywhere globally. So so I totally agree. So okay, so thank you very much. We have next 15 minutes, and I guess so far I have not received any question from Paulmi. So anyway, what we can do?
Ask a few questions, please?
Yes, sure. So what I'm just let me put like this. Let us pose some questions, okay, and then you also respond, because all of them have already delivered. Just Pisan has already so since all of you already delivered your talk, so maybe you can respond to those questions and also some comments on the overall narrative which has already been developed so far. So Mrinalini, and I have also a few questions. So Mrinalini, you start. Let me deal with the Pisan.
Handle the pigeon. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. As I was listening to all of you, I was just trying to think the ways in which we can circulate clippings of this so that we can get people to come and watch the full thing on YouTube. It was supremely informative. Thank you very much. I have a few questions. One is a question to perhaps everyone. I should have asked Venu before he began to answer. So if you could just tell us, bring in some ideas from the CSDS Lokniti data findings, because there is a clear distinction between, issues which we think should help a voter decide. And we know that that's not really playing the center stage, but what are your thoughts on that? This is to everyone. And then I have some specific questions also. So Professor Mehrotra, thank you again. So perhaps you already know about this. Goldar and Suresh Chand, they have a paper, they have a very recent paper where they question the use of the term distress employment, which we've been using very frequently in our work. And when we see a rise in the share of women, especially in unpaid labor, and that's just one way in which we identify it. We call it distress employment, and they have a full paper where they say that they provide evidence that, well, that's not the case. So it would be very, very useful if you could define some clear metrics of defining distress itself in the labor market, which can help us identify it, whether it's there or not. And for Ms. Rao, again, thank you so much. So I have two questions for you, ma'am. One is that it's actually related to the book, because I was just curious to know something. So your book argues that unless good health is prioritized as a national goal, which is what you also brought in your talk, India's growth story will remain largely self-congratulatory. So when you say this, are you alluring to the point of the GDP growth and how celebrating that is really meaningless? I mean, at least the least one can do is talk about per capita GDP growth, because see, even there we know it's still an average, but at least we are knowing something about per individual. And the second thing is that you mentioned Ayushman Bharat, and you rightly said it's a national public health insurance program. But in Delhi, for example, we have these mohalla clinics wherein, we see that costs are subsidized on a daily basis. One can walk in and get cheap medicines, free injections, simple things like that. So would you propose that this could be a possible way of tackling the problem? So kind of putting more money in primary health centers such that, in fact, that's one of the arguments I make, that it can also be a way of creating employment. So we know that, say, in the medical sector, we have MBBS, and MBBS are largely unemployable because you want them to also have a master's, an MD or an MS. So perhaps the primary health centers could have more MBBS people coming in, and because they're fully qualified to handle those, and you kind of distribute it. So it could also help us in tackling the job problem. So something on those lines. It'll be great to hear from you both. Thank you.
I think because we have a limited time, so let me pose all questions, and then so all panelists can respond. So okay, so my question is, actually, if we look at the policy discourse recently, so most of the times when you talk about structural transformation or employment generation, and maybe Professor Malhotra can answer that. So most of the hurdles which are basically talked about are labor laws, for instance, lack of credit, institutional credit and all, or environmental laws. So, and in fact, awareness and skill. But what we can definitely see that even educated are not getting employment. So largely these kind of factors are somehow not being able to sort out the problem. So what, in your opinion, so how far the role of demand is there overall in terms of structural transformation? That's one. And Professor Surajit Majumdar, so what I wanted to know, actually exactly the question which Ms. Rao actually posed, from where money would come from. So if we need to prioritize our expenditure towards health expenditure, and of course to reduce inequalities and all, what kind of fiscal priorities, what money, first money would come from, where money would come from, and then what kind of fiscal, kind of restructuring or priorities you can think of. And yeah, so, and there's another question to, I guess there, I don't know, 251. So, okay. So there's another question is from Paul Me. So also for Mr. Venu, that also could you comment on the slum removals being planned, the environmental policies that are altered to affect the communities living nearby, the demolition drives without notification, and how the lower income class is or is not an electoral vote priority. And then another question for Ms. Rao, that alongside the schemes that were made possible for health and food, especially if we look at the ones during the pandemic, those were contingent on two things: access to tech, Arogya app, etc., and identification, Aadhaar, etc. So people who didn't have these or any of these did not resort to apply to these aids. How does this show up in government display of the efficiency of their schemes? So these are the questions, maybe 2 minutes for each of you, and then we'll 2-3 minutes. Yes. So Professor Santosh Mehta, you can start.
Thank you very much. I'll try and address both your question to start with, and then to go to Mrinalini's question. So in my understanding, actually, demand has become a very big problem. And if I had had the time, I would have shown you on my last slide, which actually builds on the argument that Surajit made. So let me use my 2 minutes to actually make one point in that regard. You see, what are the 4 drivers of growth? One is consumption, the second is investment, and I think Surajit rightly made the point that investment has barely been, so there's been very low investment demand. So investment has kept between 26% and 31% of GDP, when this government inherited a 31% to GDP in investment rate. So between 4 and 14, the investment ratio was 31% to 38% somewhere. So investment has not picked up. We are still at 29%. Exports actually fell. Amanindra, they actually fell for 5 years in merchandise goods. It's only services which kept them up. So, and third major, which is sort of goes to the question of demand, even more to the consumer demand. The data is so evident that consumption has recovered to pre-COVID levels, but not gone much beyond that. At the same time, household savings to GDP ratio has actually fallen. It used to be in the region of about 20-24%. It came down to 17. It is now at 20. So why is that? Why are household savings low? Because obviously jobs are not growing, incomes are not growing, and people, if they are maintaining consumption, they're dissaving. So, okay. So this is point one. And let me turn to Mrinalini's point, which is about defining distress. I mean, I find Goldar disingenuous on this regard. I have to say, I haven't read the paper, but it is so staring you in the face that if you get an increase of 60 million workers in agriculture in 3 years, then inevitably wages are going to fall. So point is, the evidence is showing that wages are not rising. Secondly, among those who are working in agriculture, there is a sharp increase in women, young women who are better educated. There is a very sharp increase in own account work. And there is a very sharp increase in unpaid family labor. For God's sake, an increase in 4 years of unpaid family labor by 50 million when it was consistently declining. You have to be truly disingenuous to think that unpaid family labor and a rise in female labor force participation on account of that is not distress. And finally, in estimates that I've made, and we've not made public, but we've sent the paper to EPW, 62% in our most recent estimate, 62% of all of our entire workforce, and I'm looking at earnings of self-employed plus regular wage workers plus casual wage workers. In other words, the entire spectrum. 62% earn less than 200 rupees a day. Half of that earn less than a wage of less than 100 rupees a day. Goldar doesn't work on this data. I'm sorry. So he can go on, deciding on whatever, distress measure that he wants to. Mrinalini also asked for CSDS Niti. I think when Venu was speaking, it's very important that we bring this out on the corruption point, Venu. It's very interesting that what comes out in this most recent survey.
Yeah, that last 5 years has gone up quite a bit. Yeah.
In 2019, there were 40% who believed, because they do ask the same question.
Yeah.
5 years ago. Do you see corruption having increased, says the same, or declined? In 2019, 40% had said corruption had increased. 5 years on, now in 2024, 55% are saying it has increased.
55%. Yeah.
By contrast, in 2019, 37% had said corruption had come down. Now, only 19% are saying corruption has come down. So, the message about electoral bonds is an open and shut case of corruption. That message is getting across. And please remember, this was done early April when the messaging about electoral bonds was still getting through. And finally, on the employment, CSDS Lokniti is just stunning, I feel. And this is very important to point out because youth were voting in 14 for BJP. They voted in even higher shares in 2019, but I am sure that they have become much wiser because 62% of those who were asked the question, is it more difficult or less difficult or as difficult to get a job? 62% is more difficult. much higher than in 2019. And that number share rises to 65% in urban areas. So the point is, it's a real no-brainer, honestly, that the corruption point has really gotten through to the ordinary people. And last point, last sentence, Avanindra, I think on Venu's point, Veera, I would very strongly recommend your faculty and students who've not seen Viral Acharya's paper, Brookings Institution, last year, which shows beyond a shadow of doubt that the concentration in our industries across sectors has grown enormously, with the top 5 houses gaining at the expense of the next 5, and those gaining at the expense of the next. It's not just organized versus unorganized. It's not just that. It's much worse. So when Piketty, Chancellor, etc., the World Inequality Report say wealth inequality is what it was like in British Raj, I'm willing to believe that, regardless of what Surjit Bhalla, while misquoting in Indian Express a footnote, misquoting, might like to pretend.
Thank you.
Can I, I was going to give that data. Mrinalini referred to the CSDS survey. So I'm happy that Santosh has spoken about the increased perception of corruption. And there is, and in regard to, I would also like to point out that, a global investor, this is very interesting, a well-known global investor and author, Ruchir Sharma, who's written many books. He was the head of Morgan Stanley Investment Management in New York, and currently heads Rockefeller Capital, is chairman of Rockefeller Capital. So he was at an Express Adda function, in Bombay, which Indian Express organizes. Meet. They gather, industrialists in Bombay, and they meet the guest kind of program, where he said, very clearly, he said that one reason why FDI, foreign investors, even domestic investors, one reason why investments, private investors are reluctant to put in money. One reason. And he used the term iced, and he explained what iced, ICED, income tax, CBI, enforcement directorate. He says there is a genuine fear of these agencies being used selectively, even among corporates. So they feel that companies do not have the confidence to, foreign investors particularly, to set up something in India, and they do not have the confidence that they'll be provided a full level playing field. And I'll give you a simple data point, Amanindra. The FDI as a ratio of GDP used to be 1.6% in 2020-21. It is in 23-24, it is down to 0.5%. It is abysmal. And okay, I'll give you another shocking piece of data. The net FDI inflow is in 23-24 is lower than what individuals send money outside with a limit of $250,000 per individual under the RBI's remittance scheme. Outward remittance. Outward remittance is some $28 billion. FDI, net FDI was less than that. And yesterday there was a news in Economic Times that government is trying its best to curb this outward inflow, because the government suspects that a lot of millionaires are going abroad seeking tax residency. One member is going abroad and he's taking money through the LRS route annually to $250,000 to buy property there and for maintenance of his living standards there. So there is a big worry. Now, these are not symptoms of an economy which is greatly attractive for new investments. And I'll end by saying that I would invite any researcher in Jindal to study whether there has been a block of 10 years since 1991, a block of 10 years when private investment has been stagnant. It has not taken off. Tell me if there's a block of 10 years where we've seen business cycles which have been, where, they have been up and down, but I've not seen a block of 10 years when private investment is stagnant and industry capacity utilization has hovered between, say, 55 and 75%. It has not hit 90% when they actually start making new investment. Businesses start, deciding. New investments, fresh capacity building has not happened in India, in spite of the concentration problem that Santosh spoke about.
Thank you. So maybe Professor Majumdar and Ms. Rao, very briefly, maybe 1 minute or so.
Yeah.
We already exceeded the time.
So let me answer the question you posed, okay, with just some basic facts. India has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. Okay, even when you compare India with other countries, it's similar per capita income levels. Okay, and the tax to GDP ratio in India is not increasing. Okay, it's not just that it's low, it's not increasing. Now you have a situation in India, if you look at the tax structure, okay, 18% of GDP comes as tax revenues to center and states. 6% is direct taxes, which are exclusively paid by those top 10% of the population, which accounts for 57% of India's national income. 12% comes from indirect taxes, in which the remaining 90% who get only 43% of the national income also contribute. Okay, so it's not a problem that there is no resources available. Okay, and the fact that that resource is not being tapped, and instead everything is about reducing that, is the corruption which takes the form of acts of omission, not acts of commission, acts of omission, which no law even recognizes as corruption. Okay. And the problem is that this structural reality in turn feeds on that. So those who are the beneficiaries of this, they also seek to use their command over resources to maintain this particular position. Now, if for that benefit, they would at least do the thing of using these resources in a way which would generate employment and jobs for the rest of the population, then one could still accept it. But here it is, all those concessions are given and there's no return. Okay, this investment that Venu was talking about, I mean, no research is required, there is no period like this. And if the private corporate sector truly feels that India's economic prospects are very bright, why are they not investing? They are themselves, in a sense, aware of what is the reality of the Indian economy. Okay. Finance Minister asked them sometime back after COVID, why aren't you investing? And my immediate question when that question was asked was, how did it take so long to ask this question? It's been happening for a long time. Just that somehow policy making is blind to that. Deliberately or otherwise, it is blind to the fact that the investments, it's stark. It's so stark that no amount of jiggling around with accounts or statistics can hide it. But that's not a central thing that... so you are supposedly seeking to grow through a private investment, corporate investment-led growth process. That's not happening. But all the policies are supposed to be to induce that to happen.
Can I just add one thing here to what Surajit said? With the permission of chair, can I? Huh?
Please.
Nirmala Sitharaman, it's very interesting. Nirmala Sitharaman made a very interesting statement some 7-8 months ago. She was addressing some industry association and she told them that why aren't you investing? Please invest. And then she said, you are like Hanuman. She likened the industry to Hanuman that does not recognize his own strength. Hanuman is known not to recognize his real strength. So she actually said this to the industry, and to which one journalist, one cynical journalist said that it is not that the Hanuman is not recognizing its strength. Today there's a situation where even Lord Ram is not able to help.
Okay, so Avinindra, very quickly. Yeah,
Yes.
because I have to
please.
also run. I have
Okay,
to
you
also
can
run
take,
for
yeah,
another
it's okay,
talk.
2-3 minutes. I already took, yeah, so you can.
Yeah, now look, I'm being very nice to you, saying I'll finish it quickly. Now, if you put 3 minutes, I'll take 5. You guys are pushing poor health into the last corner. But anyway,
No,
I
but
have to
please
also
take your
run.
time, ma'am. Please take your time.
No. I'm just joking, but I do have to go. The thing is that, I mean, yes, you are right. I was talking about the GDP. But in this context, I just want to say that, the 3 panelists have spoken about how bad the economy is. And I'm just wondering why the citizens, it doesn't seem to matter. I mean, when I remember onion prices went up, Sheila Dikshit's government came down. And here such havoc is being played. And there's still, all your surveys and all show that BJP is so popular. I don't know, it's a very strange anachronism. But, if you notice, health and education really started getting traction for the first time, not in this election, but say last election, when Kejriwal's, pitch for education and health in Gujarat, wherever Punjab, it really did get traction and it did make a difference. That means Mohalla clinics have really mattered to the common people. The improvement of the government schools has really mattered to the poor people. And so when government does things that matter to the people, then they're not going to be interested in all the flowery language or Ram Mandirs or anything like that. Then they're just set aside. So I think Mohalla clinics were really a good roaring success. I don't know how they've been implemented, but whatever it is, they showcased it very well, and I think it's an excellent scheme. Many states have copied it, and I think that's the way to go. Regarding human resources, we have a huge shortage of human resources. We have half the surgeons that we need. So half the people who need surgery are going without surgery. That's the real truth of the matter. So whether it's MBBS or whatever the deployment of trained people, I think we have a very major problem on HR, and opening more and more colleges in Hazaribagh and this place and that place doesn't help, because the quality is so poor. Even AIMS, which is a central government project, has serious problems of faculty. Though, AIMS pays much better, the security of job, and they're not able to get faculty. So you can imagine how we are training doctors who are quite poorly trained and what implications it's going to have. And regarding your ID access, I fully agree with you that, you have any barriers like Aadhaar card and all that, you're denying the poorest of the poor. And I saw this happen actually in Jharkhand, where, if you remember, the tribal's daughter who died, and at that time I was there, all the ration shops are very powerful. They had tons of food, but then, because that wretched thing wouldn't work, what is the thumb impression you have to put on a machine? Biometric didn't work and all that, so they were being denied their rations. So these kind of barriers to access and all that need to really be off. And that's what universal healthcare is all about. Irrespective of whether you have a certificate or not, you get the service if you need it, period. And that's the approach that we need to take, instead of constantly identifying where you are from and whether you have an Aadhaar card or not. That's a very quick reply to your very long question. Thanks very much for this opportunity. And Avinindra, I'm so grateful that I'm in the midst of such hotshot economists, because, health ko bhi thoda status mil gaya.
No, probably it actually changed the entire discourse in the world, development trajectory. Entire growth was dependent on health. For maybe the debate is centered around that only.
Yes, you are all discussing health.
Yeah, exactly.
You haven't said
health of the economy or health of the people.
Exactly. Which are both are so interconnected. Only COVID told us that those are so interconnected.
That is true. And education, it's worse.
Yeah.
We are not even spending 3% of budgets are going for education when the minimum is 6%. Yeah. Anyway, it's a sad story.
Yes, Professor Malhotra, just.
Yeah, absolutely. Two, 3 liners. just to support Sujata Di, we should remind all your listeners that it's this government and its national health policy which had committed in 2017, beginning of 2017, to reach 2.5% of GDP on public health expenditure. Despite a pandemic intervening, we are still at a maximum of 1.3% of GDP. In other words, half. This is simply unacceptable.
Callous.
Callous
Callous.
beyond belief. And this is a government which came to power on a new education policy in 2020, where they claim we want to get to 6% of GDP on public expenditure. For the entire 2004 to 14 period, it used to be 4% on education of GDP. It is now 2.9%, as Sujata Di said. We must never forget this. And finally, last sentence, because you began with industrial policy, my friend. I think we have to have 30 years we haven't had an industrial policy. We finally have to have an explicit industrial policy, and neither Make in India is an industrial policy, nor is PLI, the performance-linked incentive scheme, an industrial policy. I've written on this. I have a whole chapter in my book in CUP 2020. You guys are willing to have welcome to have a look at it.
Thank you. I guess now it's end of this exciting panel discussion. Definitely, I definitely would like to have more discussions, but time will not allow that. So thank you very much, all of you. It was much insightful, and
thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much,
and you will be hearing from us again. Please do come back. Okay,
yeah, definitely.